The Beatles, the Fab Four, John, Paul, George and Ringo. No other musical group in history has achieved the level of notoriety that this four-headed monster off of Liverpool have. With their string of groundbreaking records and relatively small window with no reunions, being huge contributors to that, since it built up the legendary and almost mythical status of the band. But of course, when it comes to a successful band, there are usually a lot of people outside said band that are deemed crucial to its development, either by having created it after which they were fired or left of their own accord, or by having a say in the group's music and career for the majority of their existence. The Beatles were no exception to this. Throughout the group's existence, and long after they disbanded, there were a lot of individuals who were nicknamed the Fifth Beatle. The main candidates for this title, and rightfully so might I add, are usually Brian Epstein, their manager from 1961 up until his death in 1967, who discovered them, cleaned their act up a bit, and turned them into the global sensation they became, and George Martin, who served as their producer for practically their entire career, aiding in the development of their own sound and in the near constant sonic innovation after their sixth record, 1965's Rubber Soul. Although these two are usually the people that come to mind when discussion on the Fifth Beatle arises, they are far from the only candidates. Some people, for example, consider Pete Best, the Beatles' drummer before Ringo, to be the Fifth Beatle. But today, we're not going to talk about any of these three. No, today we're going to talk about someone who was incredibly influential in the early history of the band, and whose artistic talents were more well known outside of the realm of music. Someone who willingly stepped away from the Beatles to pursue his true artistic passion, passing away shortly after, at a very tender age. This is the story of the Beatles' original bass player, Stuart Sutcliffe, the original Fifth Beatle. Stuart Ferguson Victor Sutcliffe was born in June 23, 1940, in Edinburgh, Scotland. He was the son of Martha and Charles Sutcliffe. Martha was a school teacher, whilst Charles was a senior civil servant, and the reason why Sutcliffe and his family moved from Edinburgh to Liverpool when little Stu was only 3 years old. Charles moved to help with wartime work, and subsequently took a job as a ship's engineer, and was rarely home throughout Stuart's childhood. When he was home, he was always drunk, and often physically abused his wife in front of young Stuart. The void left in Stuart by his absent father was filled reading, writing, and especially drawing. It looked like he valued the hardships he had gone through at this time, since he wrote in his notebook at a young age that we young artists are like young sailors. Unless we encounter rough seas and are buffeted by the winds, we'll not become real sailors. Stuart was a very gifted painter from an early age. He was recognized for his artistry and won several awards in the area around Liverpool. What he wasn't very interested in at the time was music. In fact, his musical background was deemed to be a little limited. He'd had a couple of lessons as a kid, sang in the church choir, and owned a guitar he barely played. In 1956, he entered the Liverpool College of Arts, where he quickly established himself as one of the best painters. In there, he met fellow student John Lennon. According to Cynthia Powell, Lennon's first wife, Sutcliffe patiently taught Lennon how to think about painting, while Lennon lectured him on the new music being created at the time in the United States. While they both bonded over their shared love of literature. Stuart eventually met other future members of the Beatles, Paul McCartney and George Harrison, while they were all playing with Lennon and the Quarrymen, the precursor of the Beatles. Harrison took a liking to Sutcliffe, quoting him, "Paul and I got to know Stuart Sutcliffe through going into the art college. Stuart was a thin, arty guy with glasses and a little Van Gogh beard, a good painter. John really liked Stuart as an artist. Stuart obviously liked John because he played the guitar and was a big Ted. Stuart was cool. He was great looking and had a great vibe about him, and was a very friendly bloke. I liked Stuart a lot. He was always very gentle. John had a slight superiority complex at times, but Stuart didn't discriminate against Paul and me because we weren't from the art school. He started to come and watch us when we played at parties, and he became a fan of ours. He actually got some parties for John, Paul, and me to play at." Paul McCartney, on the other hand, was a bit jealous of his relationship with John Lennon. See, at this point, Lennon and Sutcliffe were best friends, and McCartney felt left out because almost all of Lennon's attention went to Sutcliffe. Quoting him, "When Stuart came in, it felt as if he was taking the position away from George and me. We had to take a bit of a back seat. Stuart was John's age, went to art college, and was a very good painter, and had all the cred that we didn't." Near the end of 1959, Sutcliffe sold a painting to an art exhibition for £90. The other three pressured him to buy a bass and joined them. Initially reluctant, he eventually gave in, and on January 21st, 1960, he bought a bass and joined the others as their new bassist. Sutcliffe was not a natural musician, but he practiced a bit, and he compensated in other ways, becoming, according to Harrison, a sort of art director for the band in those years. Sutcliffe moved into an artist's loft, and Lennon moved in with him almost immediately. McCartney and Harrison were also a near constant presence in that house. It was here where, unbeknownst to him, Sutcliffe was involved in one of the most important decisions of his life. He and Lennon wanted the new group to have a name that was basically a pun, and so they both had an idea. They loved Buddy Holly and the Crickets, so they wanted to name themselves the Beatles. But they took the chance to change the second E into an A as a nod to the Beat Generation, a literary movement that took form in the 50s. Later, as they were going for a walk, they informed the other two members of the group's new name. The name later changed to the Silver Beatles, and then eventually, by August of 1960, became simply the Beatles. Through Sutcliffe, the band met Alan Williams, the owner of the Jacaranda. Williams, enchanted by their style and by Sutcliffe's artistic disposition, began to take an interest in the group, becoming their unofficial manager, booking them a tour throughout the Scottish coast, and eventually granting them the opportunity of a lifetime when a club promoter in Hamburg requested 5 English musicians to perform. And so, the group traveled for Hamburg. When they arrived in Germany, they played dozens of shows just in the first few months. The length of these shows was excruciatingly long, between 6 to 8 hours. But this did wonders for them as a group. As Sutcliffe noted in a letter around this time, "We have improved 1,000-fold since our arrival." Soon after, Astrid Kirchherr, a photographer, met the group and started taking pictures of them. Eventually, she fell in love with Sutcliffe, and the feelings were reciprocated. When the group was ordered to go back to England, Sutcliffe alone stayed in Hamburg, hesitant to go back to Liverpool. although he eventually went back to playing a few gigs in early January 1961. In Liverpool, he received a savage beating in which he was violently kicked in the head. Don't forget this detail, since it will be very important in a couple of minutes. By March, the group headed back into Hamburg, where they played over 90 shows in the following 3 months. During this period of time, Sutcliffe was spending more and more time with Kircher, immersed in the city's art culture, and it was only a matter of time before he had to make a choice. Between June and July of that year, Sutcliffe left the Beatles, never to return to the band. The Beatles returned to Liverpool, while he stayed behind in Hamburg. After leaving the group, Sutcliffe sold his bass to buy paints and canvases and started painting right away. He also began experimenting with other art mediums. According to letters sent to his sister Pauline, he started making short films and found a great instructor in Eduardo Paolozzi, a British professor at the Hamburg Art School. His creativity wowed Paolozzi, who claimed the following: if he'd lived, he could easily have been the Beatle. He was imaginative, ultra-intelligent, and he was open to everything. At this moment in time, Sutcliffe seemed to be living exactly the way he'd always wanted to. But this period of time was tragically short-lived. You see, Sutcliffe had begun to suffer from mysterious and overwhelming pains throughout his body in 1961, while he was still a member of the Beatles. And throughout the year, his symptoms only got worse and worse. In January of the following year, he started having convulsions, which prevented him from attending art classes. So he returned for a short while to Liverpool, where he worried everyone around him. He confessed to Lennon that the pains were so strong that he thought of throwing himself out of a window, and Sutcliffe's mother described his pain as a bomb going off in his head. In February, when he returned to Hamburg, he collapsed in an art class. Kircher's mother had Sutcliffe analyzed by German doctors, but they didn't seem to be able to find the cause of Sutcliffe's headaches. In April 10th, he collapsed again, and Kircher went with him to the hospital in an ambulance. But he died before he ever got to the hospital. He was only 21 years old. The cause of death was deemed as a brain hemorrhage due to an aneurysm that had burst in the right side of his brain. There are two possible causes that I could find for this. The first one is that Sutcliffe suffered from a rare condition that caused his brain to grow in size and press against his skull, which is what caused him immense pain. This is what the German doctors first told Kircher when he passed away. But another theory is that this stemmed from an injury he had suffered from being assaulted to the right side of his head, which leads us to the fight that I mentioned previously in 1961 in Liverpool. People suspect that that fight is what caused the brain trauma to the side of his head that was responsible for his early passing, but we will never know for sure what the cause was. 3 days after Sutcliffe's untimely passing, Kircher went to meet the members of the Beatles at the Hamburg airport, with the band returning to live in Hamburg for a while. They were all in shock to hear the news, but no one grieved more than Sutcliffe's best friend, John Lennon. Quoting Kircher, John went into hysterics. We couldn't make out whether he was laughing or crying because he did everything at once. I remember him sitting on a bench, huddled over, and he was shaking, rocking backward and forward. Lennon was a mess, but he had almost no time to grieve. Just a couple of months later, in June, the Beatles' first recordings with EMI took place, where they recorded their first hit single, Love Me Do, and the rest, as they say, was history. Sutcliffe was never forgotten by the other members of the Beatles. Yoko Ono remembers Lennon telling her that Sutcliffe was his alter ego, a spirit in his world, a guiding force. And the Beatles as a whole honored his life by including him in the cover of Sgt. Pepper's, him being in the third row, all the way to the left. And that was it. It's always a shame to see someone so talented pass away so unbelievably young. Although it seems he will never pick up a bass guitar again, it would have been interesting to see what he could have accomplished in the world of painting, and in the world of art in general. But anyway, that's all I have for you today. Hope you found this video interesting, and if so, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications to see when a new video comes out. You can also follow me on Twitter, since I always tweet my new videos when they come out. And that's it. My name is Joe Fiki Fiki, and I'll see you later with another video. Bye bye.